Yestermorrow Design Build School in Waitsfield, Vermont presents Doorways to Design, the 2015 Summer Lecture Series. Tonight, SimpliPHI, the Common and the Profound, exploring the Golden Ratio, with tonight's speaker, Donna Stepien.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I've heard so much about Yestermorrow, and it feels really good to be giving a talk here. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to preface by saying that I've been interested in the Golden Ratio probably since the very late 80s, early 90s, when I started teaching communication design, which is also known as graphic design or graphic visual communication. Different people will use different terms. And I came across a term, a page in one design book. And this was after having gone through undergrad school and graduate school, and I'd never heard of the Golden Ratio. And I came across a page in a design book that said, this is the Golden Ratio, and it pretty much had a diagram that looked something like this. And it said, it's used in art, architecture, and design, and it has been used for centuries, and it's important. And that's all it said. And it didn't show how it's integrated. And I thought, well, if it's so important, then why didn't I ever hear about it, and why is it given such short shrift? So I started getting really interested, and I started doing some of my own research. And like I said, it was right around the very early 90s that I started. So this lecture is a compilation of information gathered over the past 25 years. So I tend to jump around a lot, so I do have a written paper that I will follow, but I will also ad-lib as I go. So I will be referring to the built environment, which I'll define as whatever it is that men or women make or have made that contributes to living and working space. Can everybody hear me? Okay, not too loud, not too, just good? Okay, thank you. The built environment includes buildings we make. It also includes the tools we make and we use in our homes and in our work, products, furniture, artwork, books, newspapers, anything that people make that is not of nature to use or use in communicating with each other in the broad sense. By looking at how proportion is used in design as it applies to living environments, and by looking at actual examples, we can see practical uses of geometry applied in many cultures throughout history and in various disciplines. Historically, the formal study of geometry, biology, music, philosophy, anthropology, and the various design disciplines such as architecture and book design have common foundations in their use of certain proportions. Historical evidence cites people have made conscious choices to repeatedly use certain very specific proportions, usually the 1-to-1 or square, 1-to-2, double square, 2-to-3, which is the Golden Ratio, Fibonacci. It's the Fibonacci number or the Golden Ratio, and the 3-to-4. People have used these ratios to make things to shape their environment. Artifacts reveal indigenous peoples from all parts of the world and spanning centuries in time have used the same proportions in making their built environment. This suggests certain proportions appear to have been derived from nature, possibly in an intuitive manner, although historically they were also seemingly important to scholars. I've especially explored the proportion known as the golden section, as it occurs in nature and has been used in the built environment. Johann Kepler, as quoted in the book The Sacred Geometry by Robert Lawler, said geometry has two great treasures. One is the theorem of Pythagoras, the other, the division of a line into mean and extreme ratios, that is, phi, the golden mean. According to Lawler, Whenever there is an intensification of function or a particular beauty and harmony of form, therein the golden mean lies. The golden mean is also called the golden section, the golden proportion, the phi proportion, and the divine proportion. I had a student once call it the golden rule. It's not the golden rule, but I'll take that too. It's described as the ratio wherein a certain length is divided such that the ratio of the longer part to the whole is identical to the ratio of the shorter part to the longer part. So the ratio of the longer part to the whole is identical to the ratio of the shorter part to the longer part, wherein each dimension is exactly 1.618 times the next smaller dimension. It is most often diagrammed by the golden rectangle, which is here. When the golden rectangle is constructed, it's easy to visualize the proportions. Constructing the golden rectangle reveals the logarithmic spiral. And indeed, when constructing the rectangle, if you were to draw a line from here to here, often it's done like that, and then to this corner, and then to this corner, and then there, and then there, and then there, and then there, and then subsequently smaller and smaller and smaller. So as the proportions of the logarithmic spiral, such as the square and the Fibonacci series of numbers. To illustrate the Fibonacci series, it can be seen the spiral passes, like I just showed, through diagonally opposite corners of successive squares. The smallest square has a side of length A. The adjacent second square also has a side of length A, the third 2A, and subsequent 3A, 5A, 8A, 13A, 21A, 34, 55, 89, and upwards to infinity. Expressed as a series of integers, each term after the first two is the sum of the two preceding, and I'm sure you may be familiar with this, so that you go 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and upward. So 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5, 5 and 3 is 8. And as it approaches infinity, the ratio is 1 is to 1.618. The Fibonacci series is evidenced in the f-stops of a camera. I have here, you can tell when I wrote this, it says the common 35 millimeter size of film. It's no longer common, but back in the 90s when I started doing this research, it certainly was, is exactly the golden rectangle. And as Kate and I realized when we were trying to put my slides on the board, the size of this board is the golden rectangle exactly. And that was planned. As regards the square, J. Hambidge refers to the golden rectangle as the rectangle of the whirling squares, a repetition that shows within a logarithmic spiral, each successive rectangle, you start with a little rectangle, and each successive rectangle, as you go upward, is by a root 5 square larger than the previous one. The elements of dynamic symmetry indicate that if you add 1 to phi, you get its square, phi times phi. If you subtract 1, you get its reciprocal, 1 over phi. Each time a square is subtracted from the golden section, a new golden section remains. And you could see that if I were to eliminate this big square, I would have this rectangle. If I were to eliminate this big square, I would have this rectangle, and successively downward and successively upward also. Phi proliferates in nature and is most frequently diagrammed by the nautilus shell. The growth of the chambered nautilus exactly represents the logarithmic spiral. Golden ratio is seen in seed distributions also in many plants. Sunflowers, cacti perfectly demonstrate the proportions of the logarithmic spiral. This sunflower, it's hard to see the spiral in here, except, and that's kind of a pathetic little sunflower. But my son took that photograph when he was a little boy, and I sort of am enamored by it, so that's why I use that. This is a cactus, and you can see the progressions of the spiral a little bit better in that. And my son did not take that photo, and he's not a photographer. Phi is related inseparably and proven geometrically to the root 5 square and the pentagon. Historically, the 5-pointed star, which is represented by the pentagon, has been a symbol of the human body and life. Each line segment multiplied by 1.618 gives the next line segment, and each added to the previous gives the next. So you see, each multiplied by 1.618 gives the next, and each added to the previous gives the next. So we've got the pentagon, and if you take, one side of it and make the square, there you have it. But then if you go from one point to the next, you have the longer segment. So that is the segment that's 1. That's the segment that's 1.618. And here, what is just done in the gray area is just the longer segment just shown mirror image on the pentagon. There you go. Okay, this is a poster by the 20th century designer Jan Tschichold, and it clearly indicates the use of the pentagon in the design of the poster. And I'll read the text. The narrow rectangle format is a pentagram page and is derived from a pentagon inscribed in a circle. The top surface of the pentagon becomes the width of the rectangle, the bottom point, the bottom of the rectangle. The horizontal line in the poster is placed as to connect two of the vertices of the pentagon. So it's not just make a cool poster. It's really geometrically devised. And there's another one. You can see the pentagon here, and then how the divisions form visual divisions so that the eye is focused right into the center. So this shows the relationship drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, representing the universal man, to the square, the circle, and to phi. This is a bad slide, I'm sorry about this, but it's Albrecht Dürer's drawing of the hand and the arm. And actually, this is 1. This is 1.618. This is 1. This is 1.618. This is 1. This is 1.618, and on and on and on. And indeed, the proportions of the human body are derived that way. Here's another one where Dürer takes the female form and devises all kinds of proportions based on the golden ratio. I had put together some exercises for middle and high school math students a number of years ago when standardized testing was introduced into the schools. This was in the late 90s. And initially, as at this point still, there were a lot of issues about standardized testing being teaching to the test and not having any creativity and the stresses of teaching to the test. And so I was a member of a group of 3 professors, a math professor, a science professor, and me, who put together a 2-week workshop for middle school and high school math teachers. And one of the exercises that I derived was to plot on a graph the proportions of the human body just by measuring from the top of the head to the chin, from the top of the head to the shoulder, from the top of the head to the floor, from the shoulder to the floor, from the elbow to the floor, from the wrist to the floor when the person was standing like this. And if you plot all the joints and then connect the dots, you get a perfectly proportioned person. And especially middle school students who are beginning to get very conscious of their inability to draw well. I'm sure you may have experienced young children saying, oh, they draw until they're maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years old, and then they start thinking, well, I really don't know how to draw because it doesn't look real. Well, when the human body is measured and plotted out on a graph, middle school students and high school students and these teachers who were in the workshop were saying, wow, I can draw a proportional human being, and they were beginning to realize things like the distance from the longest finger to the wrist is almost the same as the distance from the wrist to the elbow. And a lot of times when people draw hands, they draw them so tiny, but when plotted out, it becomes evident that the proportions are not as people might expect them to be. Mathilde Geike has shown that phi is represented in the average or ideal face. She uses as an example Miss Helen Wills. Does anyone know who Helen Wills was? Helen Wills was an Olympic tennis champion. She won the gold medal in the singles and doubles in the Paris 1924 Olympics. So Geike uses her as an example. Presumably, as a great athlete, she was expected to exhibit the divine proportion. And you see the golden rectangle, which is touching the widest points of her face and the top of her head and the bottom of her chin. The proportions drawn in here to then develop golden ratio proportions from, I think it's from the middle of her eyes to the bottom of her mouth and things like that were done also. But you can see that she exhibits the golden ratio. So she was perfect. Jonathan Hale, in The Old Way of Seeing, tested this out with Audrey Hepburn in the movie, from the movie Funny Face. This is a film still, apparently, from the movie Funny Face. So I tested this, okay? And there I am, many years ago, with the golden ratio proportion from the top of my head to the bottom of my chin, widest points of my face, and then the middle of my eyes to the middle of my forehead, and then down to the center of my face. So indeed, I had found that researchers have measured people's width to height ratios of their faces, and the more subjects in the survey, the closer to 1.61, 1 is to 1.618 it becomes. So Hale used a quote from Funny Face to segue his analysis of the proportions of Audrey Hepburn's face to the proportions of a tree. Apparently, Fred Astaire says, when I get through with you, you'll look like, well, what do you call beautiful? A tree. You'll look like a tree. So there's a tree, and there's the golden ratio proportion. I also tested this. I took a picture of a tree, and there's the golden ratio proportion. It works. Historically, phi has been demonstrated in the artifacts of many cultures, both those with and without a written language. The literature of many disciplines, including biology, such as the DNA double helix, the spiral of which conforms to the Fibonacci series, and music. This slide shows Pythagoras, his diatonic scale. He determined that numerical ratios produced harmonious sounds. This and similar proportional relationships in music, as discovered by Pythagoras, have been cited as the first step towards the mathematization of human experience, and therefore the beginning of science. Historical reference to craft are abundant with examples of phi. Basketry woven by American Indians of the Pacific Northwest 500 years ago, the Makah Indians, the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwaikutl peoples, peasant carpets from East Prussia and Mexico, Chilkat blankets, Chinese vases from the Sung Dynasty of 1200 AD, Greek pottery from the 6th century BC, and further back to Cretan and Mycenaean cultures of the late Bronze Age. These preceded classical Greek geometry by approximately 1,000 years, yet the same ratio is found in all. There are examples of art. Many artworks from ancient Greece and the Renaissance contain evidence of the intentional use of phi. This is phi contained in the pentagon, which determines the proportions of the ancient mask of Hermes. Examples from architecture include ancient Egyptian and Mexican pyramids, Stonehenge. It's estimated to have been built between the 20th and 16th centuries BC. So there's Stonehenge, and this is an example of the archway through which the sun appears on the first day of summer, and it shows the archway. It shows the proportions of the archway as a 3-4-5 triangle. And I'd like you to keep this little diagram in mind, because I'm going to be showing a slide a little bit later of architecture that, well, tipped on its side, looks very similar to this analysis of proportion. Obviously, the Parthenon demonstrates the basic dimensions of phi. This is the front elevation. Phi is revealed in the Roman Colosseum, in Japanese temples, referenced in the literature of early European typeface design. Fibonacci, for example, was an Italian who studied in North Africa. He is credited with introducing Arabic numerals to Italian scribes. Albrecht Dürer is said to have used phi in his analysis of the alphabet. According to Robert Bringhurst, who wrote The Elements of Typographic Style, the golden section was much admired by Renaissance scribes who often used it in their work. It's been much admired by book designers in the modern age. Paperbacks in the Penguin Classic series have been manufactured for more than a half-century to standardized size, which embodies the golden section. Bringhurst explores the use of phi in book design. So here's Tragedy of King Lear from the Penguin Classic series, designed by Jan Tschichold, probably in the 1950s, I think, to the golden ratio proportion, and I think the Penguin Classic series still is, to this day, golden ratio proportion. This is a book page layout that's determined entirely by geometry. No measuring device was used, simply a straight edge. It's a little bit hard to see, but the way it's determined is the width of the page, and this is a 2-page spread, is the height of the block of text. And you will find that proportion used in almost entirely in medieval books, in Renaissance books, and in books of William Morris, if you're familiar with William Morris, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is typeface design by Albrecht Dürer. The Rosetta Stone embodies an example of early written language and, according to Suzanne West, reveals an interweaving of the evolution of our written language. Norman Crowe recalls that the Egyptian hieroglyph for a city and the basic symbol for cities across many cultures consisted of a right-angle cross inscribed in a square or a circle. Hieroglyphs, from which the word glyph, or picture, is derived, are precursors to written alphabets. Here's a slide that shows the evolution of the Roman alphabet, from Cretan to Phoenician to early Greek to classical Greek to Latin to our modern alphabet. And this is reprinted from the first page of Gutenberg's Bible. And this is your your text block. It's divided into two, but the text block is this whole area, and the width of the page is the height of the block of the text. I have a note here that says the page of the Gutenberg Bible fills the frame of the 35 millimeter slide, which is the golden rectangle back in the day. So here we have Le Corbusier's diagram of what he called the modular. Module of gold is how it translates. It's a 6-foot-tall British policeman, apparently, with his arm outstretched next to a nautilus shell. I don't see the nautilus shell here. I think maybe I missed a slide. I'm sorry about that. The policeman shows the golden proportion relationships. The modular was created in 1946, and it represents one of the 20th century's few formal explorations of the golden proportion. Le Corbusier also used golden ratio in his architectural design. And here's a little aside that somebody gave me when they knew that I was interested in all this. You can find modular man, you can find modular woman, and you can find modular monkey. It looks a little bit off. I don't think I'd put this in the computer to double check it. It was just given to me. Artists of the Bauhaus explored phi. An example of its use is in the architecture of the Bauhaus master, Walter Gropius. Bauhaus architecture is 20th century use of the golden proportion. The artists of De Stijl, most notably Mondrian and Van Doesburg, utilized geometry in their work. This is Mondrian's famous Broadway Boogie Woogie, and this is a poster by Theo Van Doesburg, and you can see that there's your golden rectangle, and then this is again another golden rectangle. And I did, just yesterday, I scanned it in the computer and I put a golden rectangle over each one, and they're exactly perfect. Mark Rothko's work. There's another Rothko piece. Diebenkorn's Ocean Park series is also frequently analyzed for the arithmetic proportions, including the golden ratio. So here we have again Leonardo's Universal Man. Da Vinci used the diagram to illustrate the first century Roman architect Vitruvius' recommendation that temples, in order to be magnificent, should be constructed on the analogy of the well-shaped human body, in which, he said, there is perfect harmony between all parts. This illustration was in Luca Pacioli's book of 1509, entitled Divine Proportion, the Golden Proportion. Renaissance architecture and art are replete with examples of the use of the golden proportion, including Michelangelo's creation of man in the Sistine Chapel. So here is apparently the universal man with the proportion of the architecture of Vitruvius. The history of typeface design, the actual creation of letter forms using the process of movable type as invented by Johann Gutenberg, references the use of geometry and the influence of phi upon early typeface designers such as Geoffrey Torrey and Albert Dürer and Luca Pacioli. Torrey, for example, seems to exhibit in this typeface design a desire to honor the proportions of Da Vinci's Universal Man. And this is an example. I sometimes show my students things that one book will explain in one way and another book will explain in another way. And I had found the reference to the Universal Man, and you can see the reference to the Universal Man in the design of the type according to the perfect shape of the human body. But then I also found in a typography book a reference to Geoffrey Torrey designing letter forms to ensure chastity and modesty. And so the letter form covers up certain parts of the body. So take your history from the book you want to take it from, I guess. This is Albert Dürer's work. Torrey and Dürer fashioned their letter forms according to the three most perfect figures of geometry, the circle, the square, and the triangle. However, Dürer, who was absolutely brilliant and to whom phi was very important, said, "It's impossible to reduce all letters to simple geometric formulae. Some lines have to be shaped to a juster proportion." And so Dürer learned the rules, worked by the rules, and then tweaked just a little bit so it was visibly accurate, maybe not so precisely mathematically accurate. And that may have been Dürer's strength, to take the rules and learn how to tweak them and when to tweak them. References to geometry in book and typeface design include, again, Jan Tschichold in his Penguin series. He measured hundreds of medieval and Renaissance books, and he found the overwhelming majority had the proportion of 2 to 3, which is a Fibonacci proportion, the golden ratio. Here again is an example of the layout of a double-page spread of a book. The method of determining page size and text block is done only with a pencil and a straight edge. No measuring device is necessary. This is a poster designed by April Greiman in the mid-1980s for an exhibit on the modern poster at the Museum of Modern Art. And you can see she's using the golden proportion, and the width to height ratio is also the golden ratio, the width to height ratio of the entire poster. So she's using the golden ratio as her theme, and it also becomes the size of the poster. And this was done in 1986. This exhibits a recent reference to the use of phi in the design of a modern Egyptian alphabet. A student did this as a senior project at Rhode Island School of Design, where he took horizontal letters and vertical letters, and he inscribed them first within a square, and then he put the golden rectangle, you can't see the top of the slide, within the square, and the vertical letters fit from right to left, top to bottom. The horizontal letters, obviously, horizontally from left to right and top to bottom. And he designed what he called a modern Egyptian alphabet. So Nathan Crow exhibits the human body in proportion to the landscape. He says, "We intuitively structure our three-dimensional physical world. We perceive the world from a referential structure of right-angle relationships in both horizontal and vertical planes." Crow suggests, as this slide depicts, by relating the world around us to the geometry of our bodies. And so there's Da Vinci's universal man. There's a man in space, presumably at the seashore. We reconcile our place in nature. It is from this natural characteristic of perception that geometry is born. Crow illustrates his statements with this diagram that is reminiscent of Da Vinci's universal man. He also shows an example of a door frame using human proportion and harmonic geometry in architecture. It says here, the proper portioning for a door and frame derived from human proportions and harmonic geometry, illustrated in a treatise on architecture that was printed in 1545. I've become increasingly more interested in how geometry is used in design in a broad sense. And I went back to Hale, recalling his analogy from the human face to the tree, to nature, and then to architecture. So there's your human face, there's your tree, and there's architecture, another golden proportion that we're very familiar with. Hale studied mostly 19th century, some pre-19th century, but mostly 19th century architecture. Hale's an architect who works in the Boston area. And in the mid-90s, while I was researching my golden ratio stuff, I came across his book, The Old Way of Saying. I think it's published in either 93 or 94. And I was really enamored by the book because it tied architecture into actual measuring, but not measuring with a ruler, measuring with geometric proportions. And I got to thinking that this was really a neat way to teach my design students about an interdisciplinary way to look at their own two-dimensional design work. Now, this was in the mid-90s. This was shortly after Photoshop came out. This was in the early days of what we called digital design or computer design. When designers were segueing from working by hand to working on the computer. And I was finding that my design students were having a real hard time understanding how to make a grid. They would make simple, grids that really, they would just take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and, put a half-inch margin around it and then divide it in half or divide it in thirds and then put their text in it. And their grids were really very boring and very dull. And I thought, there's got to be a way to invigorate students and to give them a sense of how the typographic grid on a 2D space, this was before the internet, on a 2D space relates to the 3D of architecture. What is it about the facade of a building that is commensurate with a poster? So I devised a project after looking at Hale's picture here. This is Newburyport. And these are some of the buildings in Newburyport. And remember that slide of Stonehenge that I showed you? Some of the way that Hale recognizes the divisions and the spaces here from this building, and then he's breaking it down into its simple geometric components, reminiscent of that breaking down of the stone formation of Stonehenge into geometric components. And I looked at this and I said, well, you know what? How different is this from a typographic grid? And how can I get students to really get gung-ho about this? So I devised a project, and I was really interested, I still am, I'm very interested in interdisciplinary connections. So I devised a project for my design class where they actually went out and drew the facades of buildings. And I had them go out, and at this time I was teaching in the South Shore of Massachusetts, where there are a lot of pre-20th century buildings. So I'd have them go out and find a pre-20th century building and draw the facade. And then I would come back and I would have them take the facade and convert it to a poster. Prior to doing that, I drove around New England and I took some photographs of some buildings that I surmised had golden proportion ratios. I just loved this one. It is no longer standing. I took this photo a long time ago, and this building was in pretty rough shape then, but this is one of my favorites. This is another one. This is in Londonderry, Vermont. That's the side of it. This is my very favorite. This is at the junction of Route 11 and 30. As you go up towards Weston, as you're coming from, I don't know if you're coming from Manchester and you're going east, and then you go up towards Weston. It sits on Route 100, and I stood in the middle of the road. I wanted to get it as square as I could so it wasn't at an angle, so I could bring it into the computer and superimpose golden ratio. I assumed there would be golden ratio proportions in this. So I wanted to get as square as I could, so I was actually standing in the middle of the street on the double yellow line with semi-trucks going past me on either direction, trying to get a good shot of this when a car wasn't going by. That's the same building from the side. I think it's absolutely beautiful. That is a building that was built at the very early part of this century, right around 2000, 2002. And if you look at this, I don't know, do you guys think that this looks nice? I mean, does it my tone of voice is giving me away. But this is new architecture. This is what's happening these days. These little things, I mean, what can you say? And they clear cut the area, they plop this little house down, and it's new. That's about all you can say for it. I don't know, which do you like better? That or that? Yeah. How many of you guys like this one? Thank you. How many like this one? A few. Okay. So they were both built within a few years of each other. I moved to Massachusetts in 1999. And I decided that I actually went through some shell shock. I moved from an area of the country that is a very depressed housing market. And I did not do homework because I was really excited to move. And I thought, oh, we're going to move from Buffalo, New York to the South Shore of Massachusetts. And we're going to buy a little cape on 5 or 6 acres of land, and hopefully an antique cape. And I sold my house in Buffalo for $90,000. And then I moved to Massachusetts and found that equivalent housing was about $400,000. Plan B. We were looking at property and found a 2-acre piece of land about 40 miles south of Boston. And I thought, you know what? I've been reading this book called The Old Way of Seeing, and on the jacket it says the architect lives in the Boston area. So I contacted the publisher, said I want to get a hold of him. He actually wrote back to me. I told him I hardly had any money, but I wanted him to design a house for me. So he actually made thumbnail sketches to proportion. And from those thumbnail sketches, no architectural plans, just thumbnail sketches on, on just copy paper, took them to a builder, a local builder, and he built this house for us. Hale, of course, designed it according to golden ratio proportions. But what's really, really interesting was it was a very modest cape. We got it built within our budget and finished inside to a point where we can get an occupancy permit, and then we finished it ourselves inside. So it was very modest, yet it fit into the architecture of that part of Massachusetts. Some of the buildings were from the 1700s. The inside looked a little different. It had cathedral ceiling and modern appliances, etc. But from the outside, it fit. A UPS guy came to deliver some stuff, walked in the front door, and he said, "Wow, this is a brand new house. It doesn't look like a brand new house. It looks like all those old capes." And he said it in a way that was like, "Wow, this is pretty cool." Then a neighbor came over to introduce herself. And she walked in and she goes, "I live in a house that was built 150 years ago, and I've been in a lot of houses, but this house has the same feel as my old house does." So it works. The intentional, purposeful use of golden ratio works. So back again to the house on Route 100. I threw it in the computer, and from the bottom, well, it's going to be off just a little bit because I couldn't be super, super perfect about it, and also the house is several hundred years old, so it's not exactly square. But here's the purpley color is a golden ratio. The lime color is a golden ratio. The orangey color is a golden ratio. The chimney lines up exactly with the door. And then these things, which Jonathan Hale calls regulating lines, goes through the corner here, the corner here, the corner here, and then ends up at the bottom here. And then, each of these lines do that. They go through corners of the windows or the door frame in a very deliberate way. And I think the place is really beautiful. So after having done that, I thought, I'm gonna bring this to my students and I'm gonna show them. So I gave the students some text from Hale that talks about the golden ratio. I won't read it all right now, but you're welcome to read it, afterwards if anybody wants to. I can throw this slide back up. But I was hoping that giving the students this text would kind of like instill in them somehow the feel of what I wanted them to do. So this is a poster that a student did. That's her grid. So the students are going out, they're actually taking a photograph or doing a drawing, bringing it back, putting it in the computer, superimposing the grid lines, and making a poster out of it. So what I started finding out from students was, as they started to do this project, I had a student come to me and say, I'm taking a music class, and I would have never realized the connection between graphic design and architecture and music if I hadn't been doing this project. Because we're doing the same thing in the music class. So the connections between the different disciplines were really heightened. I've had students tell me that they would be taking the bus home, or the subway, well, not the subway, but the bus home, and they would be staring out the window and looking at buildings to try to see if they could find the relationships. One student said she actually went home and she started measuring all the windows and all the door frames and measuring her room. So what it did was it really did energize them. And instead of getting these dull grids, I started getting students really interested in what they were doing and doing grids that were proportional. And instead of taking 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, they were actually thinking about the width to height ratios of the pieces that they were designing, whatever they were. Okay, so there's a piece that a student did. This is a 2-page spread of a book, and if you see, it's the 2-page spread is obviously the double square, but then the way the student designed the text, there's a square there, there's another larger square there, and each of these baselines of text follows a square, and then obviously, if it was going to go off the page, it would be square after square after square after square. So the students really got into developing their work, not just without realizing how they got their grids, but they were really thinking about it. Back to my house. So I scanned a picture. This was actually taken by the architect. I don't know why he didn't do it square on, but I put golden ratio. So there's your golden ratio, which is halfway. If this were exactly square, I think this golden ratio comes right into the center of the door and then to the sill of the house and then to the gutter line. And then there's a square, which again bisects the house in half up to the roof line. So then I moved to Vermont. And I still didn't have any money, but I wanted to build a house. So I took money out of my pension. I bought a little piece of land. I said, okay, now I need to put a little house on it, but it has to be modest. So I called Jonathan Hale back up again, and I said, I don't have a heck of a lot of money, but are you willing to do it again? And he said, sure. So on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, he drew up some sketches, and then he ended up writing down the proportions and the sizes of the windows. So there's a little house. That's the side of the house that he sketched up. And these two slides, the previous one and this one, are actually taken from one of his presentations on how he puts the regulating lines together. I told him that I wanted to build this house, and I eventually wanted to add on to it. So he thought about that, and with that in mind, he came up with this little cottage. And the footprint of the cottage is 16 by 20. 16 by 24? I think it's 16 by 24, which is a 2-to-3 ratio. And then you see what he calls his regulating lines on that. And then, this was in 2005, and in 2008 I added on to the house, and that's what it looks like now. So this part of it, that's not what it looks like right now, but it's what it looks like in the wintertime. So this is the part that you just saw, the drawings that he did, and this is the second part of it. I conclude my talk with books that were most pertinent to me throughout my career. And I think these four: The Old Way of Seeing by Jonathan Hale, Nature and the Idea of a Man-Made World by Norman Crowe, Lawler's Sacred Geometry, and Docci's The Power of Limits. Well, thank you, everybody.